Did you know that even the devil read and quoted Daniel? Welcome to another tidbit from the book of Daniel. I'm Dr. Paul Peterson, and the chapter we're going to look at today is Daniel 4. And we will get back to the devil's use of Daniel when we come to the end. But first, the story as we have it in the chapter. We will then look at the context within the book of Daniel, and then some thoughts about Daniel in the wider canonical perspective in light also of the New Testament. The story begins with a decree. Actually, the whole chapter is a decree. This is a continuation of previous decrees from Nebuchadnezzar, but it has confused those people who divided the Bible into verses and chapters. So you have some versions where the 3 first verses of chapter 4 are listed as the 3 last verses of the previous chapter. So depending on the edition of the Bible you have, you may be 3 verses off. Some confusion. We will survive that. Now, the story in short. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He doesn't understand it. He calls upon his wise men. They don't understand it either. There's not, as in chapter 2, any secrecy to what the content was. Then, finally, he calls in Daniel, the superior wise man. He tells the dream to Daniel, and Daniel interprets it. The dream has to do with Nebuchadnezzar being presented as a tree. That tree grows to heaven. It is then cut down, and there is a judgment pronounced over Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel's interpretation is as follows: you have grown, king, to the heaven, but unless you repent, begin to reign with mercy and justice, not being oppressive, then you will be cut down and you will be judged by heaven. As the story continues, Nebuchadnezzar does not take the advice. He is still boastful and proud, and 1 year later, as he speaks about this great Babylon that he has built, he's cut down, and for 7 years he is like an animal. He's lost his mind and behaves like an animal. At the end of this period, Nebuchadnezzar's health is restored. He acknowledges that God is the sovereign king, and in conclusion, his words can be read in the end of the chapter 4, verse 36. At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. Reading from the English Standard Version. And the last sentence: now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Just 2 historical notes. First, among the many finds in the Qumran caves, that is where we have found the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is found a story about the Babylonian king Nabonidus, who is sick. He is in Tema in Arabia, and he is offering a prayer to God, and he is healed. In that story, there is also a Jewish wise man appearing. Many scholars have seen this story as a parallel, maybe a source for the narrative in chapter 4 in Daniel. Good studies, like the one by Arthur Steinman in the Concordia commentary, will show that if there is a literary dependency, it's rather the other way around. There are many differences between these stories. The Greek scholars, no, not scholars, historians, they actually contributed the building of the mighty, famous Babylon with the hanging gardens to a queen called Semiramis. Now, they didn't know about Nebuchadnezzar. Those who mentioned him by another name, Nabonidus. They didn't know. So the historical core of Daniel here is confirmed in contrast to the Greek historians. And then a little more about the main points in the chapter. There is one line that is repeated 3 times. And whenever you have a line that is repeated 3 times in a narrative, you have to look up and see this is probably important. You find it in verses 17 and in verses 25, I think it is. I have to check with a new versification. In 25 and again in verse 32. This is how it goes. The Most High rules over human dominions, and he gives it to whoever he will. In the first of these occurrences of this sentence, in verse 17, it is added, verse 17, it is added that he sets it even over the lowliest of men. This speaks about the reversal of fortunes. God can exalt the humble and he will put down the proud. The narrative also tells a little about how to rule. It gives a clue as to why are rulerships taken away from kings by God. Nebuchadnezzar is advised by Daniel to rule with justice and mercy towards his people. So he is brought down partly because of his pride in relation to God and his exploitation of the people that he rules over. Now let's look at the prayer in its context. First of all, in the context of Daniel, the remarkable is that this is a chapter that is completely articulate as a royal decree. You notice that Nebuchadnezzar was a little reluctant to accept God, and even in chapter 3, his final decree is only a prohibition to mock and persecute the Jewish God and the Jews. Now finally he has come all around and he acknowledges that all the power he has received from God alone. So he is now humble, and that is what he is expressing in the end. So in the progress of the book of Daniel, there is a development in relation to the king. Now, one short note on this extra sentence. We spoke about the fact that there are 3 statements that are, one statement that is repeated 3 times. The first time you have an added sentence. That is, as we read in verse 17, once again, God sets the kingdom or the dominion over the lowliest of men. And that particular sentence is interesting because it is repeating the key term or key word cum, setting up. In the prayer in Daniel 2:21, this is a word that is used when he says that God removes kings and sets up kings. And in chapter 3, this is a recurring verb spoken with irony about the great statue that Nebuchadnezzar has set up, that he had set up, that he has raised, and so on. So here you have it again, a reference to God setting up his king, and he will choose the lowliest of men. As we will see later in the vision in Daniel 7, when the eternal kingdom is given to the Son of Man. But that's for later, showing the wider context. In the more narrow context, within the book of Daniel, the experience of Nebuchadnezzar is known to his follower on the throne that is Belshazzar, And the judgment on him is due to the fact that he knew about all this and still he rebelled against God. And then finally, there is a link between not only the judgment theme, but the heavenly judgment in this chapter and what is to come. Because here in chapter 4 we are told that the judgment is pronounced by the watchers, by a heavenly council. That is how it is expressed in the description of the dream, that there are watchers coming down and pronouncing the heavenly judgment. Later in chapter 7 we see that heavenly judgment at the time of the end. Now let's just pause and reflect on this event in the wider canonical context, and especially in light of the usage in the New Testament. First, you have here the indication of the reversal of roles or fortunes. Those who are proud will be humbled. Those who are humble will be exalted. The dominion will be taken away from those who are proud. It will be given to those who are humble. And the crown will be given in particular to the one, the Son of Man, who humbled himself. That is the servant of God. That leads us to a reflection on some connection in theology between Isaiah, especially Isaiah 53, and this particular chapter. The Son of Man, Messiah, Christ, is given all power and is worthy of all power because he is willing to sacrifice himself. Only because he became a servant, he is regarded as worthy. Those who will abuse their power will never get it. And then in Luke chapter 4, there is a narrative about the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. And Luke tells a story slightly different from Matthew. There's a different sequence in the temptations, and the second of the temptations in Luke's sequence is in particular related to Daniel 4. Now I will read to you what the devil says according to Luke, what the devil says to Jesus. To you I will give you all this authority and the glory, for it has been delivered to me, and I give it to whom I will. If you then will worship me, the devil says, it will all be yours. First, he had in a vision shown all the kingdoms of the world to to Jesus, reminding him about the vision, the one vision in the Old Testament, the vision in Daniel 7, where that show of all kingdoms is seen. The Son of Man was the one, according to Daniel 7, who would be given dominion and glory and kingdom. And the sentence repeatedly stated in chapter 4 in Daniel is that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And this is what the devil is quoting. But he is applying this text about the Son of Man to himself. So, by doing that, by using this wording of the sentence in Daniel from chapter 4, the devil presents himself to Jesus as if he, not Jesus, is the true Son of Man, worthy of eternal worship. Because in chapter 7, as we will see in a tidbit yet to come, those who worship the Son of Man will receive the kingdom. So the devil says to Jesus, I am that Son of Man, worship me and you will get the kingdom. Luckily, of course, Jesus refused. You should worship none other than God himself. Thank you for listening to a tidbit from Daniel, this time Daniel 4, where we have taken you beyond the narrow limits of chapter 4 in Daniel, looked a little at the context of the book as a whole, but also opened up for the usage of Daniel and its theology in the Bible as a whole. Welcome back for another tidbit when we continue with tidbits from Daniel chapter 5.